I grew up in a working class family with an emphasis on community and helping each other in times of need. Those of you who have listened to my reflections in the past know that those childhood experiences were very far from perfect ones, especially when it came to understanding and resisting oppressive systems from racism to misogyny. But despite those limitations, it was still there in my working class family that I received the first tools for deciphering this mess of injustice and oppression that we've collectively come to accept as normal. My father especially extolled the importance of labor and unions, as well as studying and understanding history. And even the conservative religious community that hurt and alienated me so thoroughly also gave me a lens to understand justice, peace, and a vision of healthy, happy society beyond the long reach of exploitation, violence, and inequality. I held these values in tension with the wider world around me. As a small child, everyone I knew was part of that working class, and our economic experiences were not that different from one another. Outrageous wealth mainly existed as a plot in books and movies, but I didn't have any personal experience of it. When I went to junior high, I met and befriended people for the first time whose economic world was different from my own. Suddenly, I felt a social pressure to desire things that I'd never wanted before. I took extra odd jobs, mainly doing yard work, to buy golf clubs, a sport I was both extremely terrible at playing and couldn't afford to play. And I saved up money for my first pair of branded shoes. I still remember them. It was a pair of white Nikes with an orange swoosh on them, cross trainers. I copied a friend by buying a poster that I proudly hung on my wall of a huge house with a 4-car garage, and each of the garage doors were open, revealing another outrageously expensive car. I bought a CD player, and I joined those terrible CD mail order music clubs so I could own the most popular music of the day. I even felt like something was missing in my life because I couldn't afford to buy a designer leather jacket, the must-have fashion item of my friend group in the late 80s and early 90s. My family had never been in poverty. My dad had a stable factory job with good benefits, and we had the good luck of being relatively healthy and accident-free. But when I visited friends at their big suburban homes, I began to see and feel the influence of a whole other way of life in the United States. When I encountered the academic study of economics at university, the first lecture of the first day of class introduced economics as the study of how people satisfy unlimited wants with limited resources. Our professor sped through the choices we had for dealing with this scarcity. Using resources wisely held some importance to her, but she told us it was basically impractical. Reducing our unlimited wants was dismissed out of hand. After all, one of the basic traits of being human was to never be satisfied. And this, she stressed, was really a virtue. Insatiable greed was the driving force of creativity, innovation, and productivity. So we were left with only one real option, which we would be the focus of the class: maximizing economic growth. What this emphasis amounted to was a romanticization of that growth, or growth for the sake of growth. At the individual level, the economy would be sustained by everyone always envying those above them in the social order, and their envy would inspire more and more consumption, which would keep the economy going. At the macro level, the economy would be sustained by constant expansion, new resources to extract, new labor to exploit, new technology to develop, and new consumers to entice. In both cases, contentment was an enemy. And while my professor spoke about meeting people's needs, she wasn't describing an economic system centered around care or community or human thriving. Humans existed mainly for the purpose of fueling the economic machine, which had to be fed at all costs. If we allowed it to falter, everything would just collapse. In that world, a certain amount of economic injustice, of exploitation and inequality, that was a small price to pay to save civilization. I didn't have a word for it at the time, but I was being taught a neoliberal approach to economics. First coined in 1938 by such economists as Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, neoliberalism became the favorite ideology of the very wealthy. The version I received at my conservative Christian university espoused competition as the highest value. The market became the ultimate arbiter of who succeeds and who fails, even who lives and who dies. The good citizen was the good consumer. Democratic choice became freedom to choose what to buy or what to sell. And anything that limited competition was an enemy to freedom, such as taxes, ethical and environmental regulations, public services, labor unions, collective bargaining. Everything had to be an opportunity for profit and consumption. And so it was best for everything to be privatized. Even inequality was seen as a result of merit. In this neoliberal version of the world, an unrestrained market made sure that everyone got exactly what they deserved. If you're rich, you earned it. If you're poor, you just need to work harder, hustle harder, innovate harder, and exploit every moment, circumstances, and person you can to get ahead. If you don't, well then, that's on you. There's historical context for the rise of neoliberalism. For example, the real threat of totalitarianism and fascism made arguments that associated social democracy with totalitarian regimes sound more plausible. That suspicion carried over to policies such as public assistance programs championed by Roosevelt's New Deal and the bureaucracies that administrated them and the taxes that funded them. Culturally, another shift was gaining momentum in the late 1800s and one that continues to play a key role today. William Leach, in his book Land of Desire, Merchants, Power, and the Rise of a New American Culture, described the emergence of consumerism following the American Civil War. American capitalism produced, in his words, a distinct culture, unconnected to traditional family or community values, to religion in any conventional sense, or to political democracy. Its culture was oriented around business and markets, with the exchange and circulation of money and goods at the foundation of its aesthetic life and its moral sensibility. Its prominent features, Leach explained, were fourfold: acquisition and consumption as a means of achieving happiness, the cult of the new, the democratization of desire, and money value as a predominant measure of all value in society. Leach saw the roots of this transition in American and European history, particularly in the religious mythos of many Christians. For generations, he wrote, America had been portrayed as a place of plenty, a garden in which all paradisical longings would be satisfied. But by the 1900s, a literal millennial promise of Jesus' second coming and a new Jerusalem was being transformed, urbanized, and commercialized. People were increasingly enticed to focus on personal satisfaction, and the cult of the new made certain that they always had something newer, something better, something improved to satisfy those desires. Innovation became tied to the production of more and more commodities, Leach explained. Fashion appropriated folk designs, reducing custom to mere surface and appearance. In fact, Leach called this the most radical aspect of this culture because it readily subverted whatever custom, value, or folk idea came within its reach. Although science was and still often is seen as a threat to traditional ways of life, it was not intrinsically hostile to custom or tradition or religion. Market capitalism was hostile. No immigrant culture, Leach points out, and to a considerable degree, no religious tradition had the power to resist it, as none can in our own time. Parallel to this movement was the democratization of desire. Around the second half of the 19th century, rapid industrialization brought profound cultural and social changes, perhaps most powerfully symbolized in the shift away from owning and controlling land toward owning and controlling capital. And though inequality continued and even increased, industrialization made it possible for people to imagine and desire more than they'd ever imagined or dreamed of before. Leach summarized the argument of John Bates Clark, an influential economist of the late 1800s and early 1900s. He wrote, "Despite the vast and ever-growing inequality of wealth in America, democracy could be ensured through the benign genius of the free market, which allocated to Americans an infinitely growing supply of goods and services. The new conception included equal rights to desire the same goods and to enter the same world of comfort and luxury. American culture, therefore, became more democratic after 1880 in the sense that everybody would have the same right as individuals to desire, long for, and wish for whatever they pleased." End quote. When considering how all-encompassing consumerism as a way of life has become, it's a little strange to realize it's still relatively recent, and its success in dominating the socioeconomic terrain is astounding. Leach puts democratizing individual desire in contrast with other possibilities, choices we collectively had and have to democratize other things, wealth or political power or economic power, and concludes that the market notion of democracy was perhaps the new culture's most notable contribution to the modern world. But the consequences of its success, this consumer culture, included a focus on competition, an increase in anxiety, a denial of mortality, a growing dependence on money as a measure of all things, including morality, and the prominence of marketing and advertising in our lives. Consumerism produced alienation, and alienation perpetuated consumerism. As Leach wrote, it fostered anxiety and restlessness and, when left unsatisfied, resentment and hatred. Now, about a century after the victory of the democratization of desire, this competition has become more than just familiar. It's simply the way things are for most of us, most of the time. Scarcity remains an important backdrop, especially as it interacts within oppressive systems. When we talk about consumerism, materialistic values, and scarcity, we must keep in mind how our well-being, our collective well-being, has been fragmented, individualized, and then set against one another. Economic and social disparities create the constant experience or threat of deprivation, of going without, of facing the consequences of not being able to survive in a consumer society. Andrew Stanley of the International Monetary Fund rightly calls this a lopsided world. Some 10% of the world's population owns 76% of the wealth, takes in 52% of income, and accounts for 48% of global carbon emissions, end quote. And it is human choice that creates and maintains those disparities, that lopsidedness. As Dr. Richard Ryan wrote, at this point in human history, we have enough material resources to feed, clothe, shelter, and educate every living individual on Earth. Not only that, we have at the same time the global capacity to enhance health care, fight major diseases, and considerably clean up the environment. That such resources exist is not merely a utopian fantasy. It is a reality about which there is little serious debate. Nonetheless, a quick look around most any part of this warming globe tells us how far we are from achieving any of these goals. End quote. These disparities are both between and within nations, with insulated pockets of wealth surrounded by ever-widening fields of impoverishment. This is the flowering of the democratized desire. In Ryan's words, we live by the maxim, to each according to his greed. Selfishness and materialism have been transformed from moral problems that we want to solve to cardinal goals of life that we want to achieve in increasingly winner-take-all economies. We are socialized into this system, and successfully navigating it becomes key to our survival. As Ryan pointed out, we are conditioned to evaluate our worth, our well-being, our accomplishments, not by our integrity or our wisdom, kindness, or community contributions, but in terms of what we can buy. It's not simply about having enough. It's about having more than others do. Dr. Tim Kasser, in The High Price of Materialism, examined research about wealth, consumption, and happiness, and concluded that consumerism and the materialistic values that go with it lead people to organize their lives in ways that do a poor job of satisfying their needs, and thus contribute even more to people's misery. Consumerism turns out to be really good at perpetuating economic systems organized around economic growth, but bad at perpetuating economic systems organized around human and ecological health. This is because once our basic needs are met, increases in wealth do little to improve people's well-being and happiness. Instead, Kasser writes, when people follow materialistic values and organize their lives around attaining wealth and possessions, those pursuits divert time, attention, energy, and resources away from goals that could fulfill their needs and improve the quality of their lives. In terms of well-being, those materialistic pursuits are essentially wastes of time. Part of this wastefulness is connected to the limited ability these pursuits have in meeting social emotional needs like self-worth, connection, and contribution. When we achieve a goal, we usually expect to have feelings of self-esteem and competence increase. But this doesn't happen, the research shows, with materialistic goals, which are instead correlated with lower self-esteem, even when we get what we want. With such an emphasis on comparison and competition in a context of scarcity, our self-worth becomes dependent on both our accomplishments, ever higher standards that we have to achieve, and others' praise for our accomplishments. In such a scenario, our sense of well-being is constantly under threat, and our feelings of competence and worthiness are tenuous even when they succeed. Just as there are always more things to buy to make us happy, there are always more things to prove before we can feel secure. In Kasser's words, people with strong materialistic value orientations experience persistent discrepancies between their current states and where they would most like to be. With these chronic gaps between ideals and actual situations, it's difficult to feel good about ourselves, difficult to feel good about our relationships with others. It's difficult to be happy. And that is our starting place. This has been our starting place because there have always been those among us who resisted this reduction of life to buying and selling, consuming and craving, exploiting and hoarding. The ways forward are both disarmingly simple and overwhelmingly complicated. It's simple because we know the values and practices we need to cultivate. In fact, we talk about them almost every week. Moving from competition to cooperation, consumption to care, craving to contentment, indifference to compassion, exploitation to regeneration, harming to healing, scarcity to abundance, oppression to justice. But it is overwhelmingly complicated because our survival is so often in such complex ways tangled up, tied to this current system. Psychologically, we can't help but get this message all of the time in advertisements, entertainment, job descriptions, expectations from family and friends, or even that inner voice that pushes us to prove our worth by what we produce and what we consume. Financially, we face the limitations of our debt, of our ever-increasing expenses in housing, transportation, and food, the looming costs of medical care and the threat of being without insurance, and future financial uncertainties related to social and political instability and the impacts of climate change. Socially, we find ourselves increasingly polarized, fragmented, and isolated, often without clear pathways or valuable experience for understanding and supporting our mutual well-being. Holding all of that together, getting what we need to live, while also resisting the cruelties of consumer culture is sometimes more than we can manage. So we need to be gentle and patient with ourselves and each other, even while we push and insist on moving forward. This means we also need to be honest about our own desires, goals, and consumption. We need to understand the ways that we relate to this buy and sell world and how we relate to one another. That's not easy, especially for those of us at the economic margins, when the only jobs we can get don't pay enough to live, when we work full-time and the world still tells us to go harder, to hustle, and we will finally get what we deserve. It can be difficult to not reduce relationships to transactions. So we have to also be honest about economic oppression and injustice. There can be no platitudes here. Money can't buy happiness might be the message that financially secure people need to hear, but it doesn't apply when we can't afford rent and groceries. Still, it's important to realize that being caught in consumer culture is one of the key dynamics that maintains our unjust economic systems, and our collective breaking free from consumerism is an important part of transforming that larger system that we live in. If we can see that consumerism as a way of life is built on empty promises, that well-being lies instead in those beautiful interwoven spheres of care, community, contentment, and human thriving, then that awareness is a powerful resource in itself. The scarcity that human society has amassed and then created is both real and a lie. It's real because our society has chosen to organize itself in ways that create those huge economic and social disparities. But it's a lie that those disparities and the scarcity that everyone, especially those at the margins, experience are inevitable or natural. They are not. We made them. They are ours, and we can change them. Just as neoliberalism positioned itself as a preferred alternative in the 20th century, humans are working together to imagine alternatives to neoliberalism today. One example of this is Kate Raworth's conceptualization of donut economics, which uses the shape of a donut to create a framework that acknowledges and honors a social foundation, the inner boundary representing human needs, and an environmental ceiling, the outer boundary representing the limits of our planet's health. Between those boundaries lies an abundant space for human safety and justice. As Raworth explains, humanity's 21st century challenge is to meet the needs of all within the needs of the planet. In other words, to ensure that no one falls short on life's essentials from food and housing to healthcare and political voice, while ensuring that collectively we do not overshoot our present pressure on Earth's life-supporting systems, on which we fundamentally depend. That kind of vision is not far away from the questions my economics professor asked in the mid-90s and dismissed. With the neoliberal emphasis on maximizing endless economic growth, instead of growing responsible, regenerative economic systems, we glossed over and ignored areas where we can make a big difference in creating societies that prioritize human and ecological well-being, wise use of resources, and reducing human greed. An ethic of care brings a focus to those ways we can relate to resources wisely and gratefully, instead of as objects of extraction, exploitation, and commodification. we can learn to work with our own greed, to notice the ways we are encouraged to solve our problems with purchases, and to make intentional decisions that realign economic and social realities with our shared well-being. The more often we choose to understand and act with one another in terms of cooperation and care instead of competition and craving, the more resources and skills we'll have to live, enjoy life, and find ways together to change the world. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.